Um, yes, that's the first thing that I would like to say. We will be recording this session, and I will explain why that. But before anything else, I just want to, first of all, thank you all that are joining and taking part of your time today in this Friday in different time zones to join together for this conversation that is probably the second event that marks the creation and the starting of the King's Observatory of Democracy in Latin America. This panel, Gender, Democracy, and the Possibility of Transformative Political Agenda in Contemporary Latin America, has been put together by my colleague, Andrea Espinosa, who is working with us here at King's College London, and having a fantastic group of collaborators from all over Latin America and the UK. So what is KODLA? No, this acronym that you see here, and you can see very well our logo there. Please get familiar with that because we will have quite a lot of activities around that. Very recently, we created in King's this Observatory of Democracy in Latin America. This idea came around of how we scholars from UK, of course, from King's, but especially in dialogue and in a mutual learning process with our colleagues in Latin America, we can contribute and collaborate for the development and the improvement of the democratic regimes in our countries in Latin America. Sometimes we forget that democracy is something that must be cultivated, must be cared every day with quite a lot of attention. We should never take it for granted, because when we do that, when we forget to cultivate it, it's very easy to start to have fissures and fractures in this important building. And that's why we thought that this observatory could contribute for that, could contribute as a space for participatory discussions that would bring our scholarship to an impact activity as well. So what we intend with this observatory is to bring discussions like we are having here today with you all and with us all together, that will generate some food for thought. These recordings, these videos that we'll be doing, they will be in our platform online. People can return to it, can use it as didactical material for their classrooms, for their research. And we want also to come out with a proposal of a policy paper in which we reflect what we are doing and come with suggestions of how our work, as I said, can have some impact in these democratic processes in Latin America. In the beginning, KODLA is focusing on 6 points. They will be not limited to it, but it is what we have as expertise right now that we can start to do something. We will be looking at corruption, at human rights, at elections, at military politics in Latin America, also on indigenous leaderships in democracies, and also in women leaderships in democracies, the important role that women are playing in the construction, consolidation, and transformations of democracies in Latin America. And this panel today, it's part of this topic that we have here. Again, I would like to thank you all for joining us. I would like to thank you for supporting, helping us to spread the word about KODLA, and to helping us also to make this a meaningful and relevant instrument and way of dialogue or place of dialogue for our Latin American community. And especially thanks to Andrea, again, who took the lead on proposing this, organizing this event, and will be leading you here. Well, I will pass the word to Andrea now, and she can explain how it will work, everything in our panel, how will be the housekeeping for this conversation. Thanks again, and Andrea, with you now.
Okay, hi. Hi all, thank you for joining. Thank you for joining from different time zones. Thank you for replying to all the emails and answering all the questions to put this together. That was really wonderful. And also thank you for saying yes with such a short notice. We really wanted to put this forward before we start summer vacations in Europe and start this conversation, then to restart the conversation in September in the next academic year. So that was really wonderful. Thank you again. So as you know, this is a little bit, this event has a little bit of a different dynamic. So It was not supposed to be an event for you to present long papers, because we do that a lot in panels and conferences. But it was much more a point of starting a conversation. So also, thank you for sending your questions that are included in today's agenda. And the point of today is to have a small presentation. So people volunteer 5-minute presentations. And then after that, we can start with questions that arise from those presentations or the questions that we have put forward in advance. I think all the participants, so you also have to know that the person assisting us and helping us with all the IT dynamics is Megan. Hopefully Megan can say hi in a minute. So I think Megan give everyone that it's a participant permission just to unmute yourself. And then you can just answer the question, engage with the question, ask a question to someone else. And we also have external participants that are joining this conversation. So everyone can include the people that are not hosts can include their questions in the chat, and we can read the questions. Or if you really want to read your question out loud, you're more than welcome, and you just have to raise your hand and we will unmute you, and then you can ask your question. We divided these in 2 different panels related to questions. So we are going to start with panel 1. And for that panel, we have 3 people presenting 5 minutes, and then we can start our conversation. Yeah, hopefully that make a little bit of sense, and we can start with the presentations. Is everyone okay with that? Yeah. Okay, so for the first panel, we were planning to discuss the challenges and opportunities what challenges and opportunities do women and members of the LGBTQ community in leadership positions face in Latin America? And for those presentations, we have 3 participants. So we have Malu Gato. Malu is an assistant professor of Latin American politics at the Institute of the Americas at the UCL and global fellow at the Brazil Institute at the Woodrow Wilson Center for International Scholars. We also have Catherine Reyes Holder. Sorry for that, probably mispronounce of that last name. She's an assistant professor at the Instituto de Ciencia Política de la Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile. She's also an associate research at the Multidisciplinary Center for Social Conflict and Cohesion Studies. And then we also have Juliana Restrepo Sanin. Juliana is an assistant professor of political science at the University of Florida. Her current book project analyzes violence and harassment against women politicians in Latin America, the role of women activism in bringing attention to this problem, and the development and effectiveness of state measures to end it. So maybe we can start with Malu.
Of course. Well, thank you so much for inviting me today. Andrea, will you let me know when I'm at 5 or, getting close to 5, please? Yeah, great. Well, thank you so much for the invitation. This is such a great initiative, and it's great that and also this format, it's really exciting that we're getting to actually have a conversation about these issues. I've been, when thinking about this question of the challenges and opportunities for the political representation of women, LGBTQI+ people in Latin America, I've been, reflecting on this for, especially, of course, like in my research agenda, but especially since 2020, I've been thinking about it from this exact, framework. And so today I wanted to share what I've been doing together with Deborah Tomé and in collaboration with Instituto Update, which is a civil society organization that focuses on innovation in politics in Brazil, and the work that we've been doing together to, precisely understand what are the remaining challenges, but especially how to maximize the opportunities for the representation of marginalized groups in the Brazilian context. And so I think that, and as Latin Americanists who study gender and politics, most of you will certainly know that there have been some very great developments in terms of women's descriptive representation in the region in the last 3 decades, especially since the adoption of gender quotas in Argentina and the move to parity laws across the region. While many countries in the region have been able to tackle low levels of women's descriptive representation and increase women's representation, and in some cases achieve parity, Brazil has stayed far behind the rest of the region, with women's political representation staying at 15% at the National Congress, in spite of gender quotas having been adopted in the country in 1995, applied first in 1996 to municipal elections, and then in 1997 and applied for the first time in 1999 for national elections. Part of the explanation for that remains in the in the design of the law itself. It has been revised a few times since its first adoption, most significantly in 2009 and first applied in 2010, and then again in 2018 with a judicial decision to actually try to make the candidacies effective candidacies and competitive candidacies in a system of open list proportional representation, whereby the quota cannot establish, say, a list, an ordered list system. And so without this ability to rule placement lists, the judiciary decided to set aside 30% of the party funds for the campaigns of women, and also to proportionately set aside money for the representation of Afro-Brazilians. Now, as you can possibly imagine, the implementation of that was not very good. Parties did everything that they could to undermine the change in the law. And so I would say that when it comes to some of the main challenges to women's descriptive representation, what remains are these institutional barriers, as well as the informal institutions imposed by insiders to keep marginalized groups out. Political violence is also widespread in Brazil, and I'm not going to talk a lot about that because I'm sure, Juliana knows a lot more about that than me, so I'm not going to extend myself here. The only thing that I did want to mention is that, the gender dynamic of political violence in Brazil is such that, particularly in smaller towns, people who get killed the most for political violence are men, but yet we know that the gender dynamics of political violence are very important, and that women are being kept from not only entering politics, but also actively participating in politics, particularly when they are more competitive in the electoral, in the electoral period. Now, coming to opportunities, and I only have 1 more minute, and I wanted to spend more time on that, but, I think that what's interesting is, 3 points. One, that the crisis of representation in Brazil has, in a way, provided opportunities for outsiders, but especially people from marginalized groups. We see that time and again in surveys with voters, but also focus groups. I've been conducting a lot of surveys and survey experiments in Brazil, but also did 10 focus groups with 80 voters in the 2020 elections. And we hear the same in terms of particularly benevolent sexism being something that in the context of the crisis of representation seems to be providing higher levels of support, or like pro women voter support. And the other thing that I wanted to mention in terms of opportunities is innovation that's coming from civil society. And so essentially, in the context of a lack of response or barriers that are maintained by insiders, civil society has been innovating in ways to impact formal politics and descriptive representation. And so I just wanted to mention the two biggest ways in which that has been happening. And one is the collective mandates, and I can talk more about that during the discussion. And the second one is candidate training programs, which has been really interesting in terms of how they have emerged very differently in the context of Brazil to provide support, in particular for groups, well, for candidates from marginalized groups. And so while some of them are focused on, outsiders in general, most of them are focused on supporting women or, LGBTQI plus people, Afro-Brazilians, or also youth, and people from periferias. And so I just wanted to close with that, and we can talk more about that during the Q&A. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. And that was fine. That was a very interesting point, and you keep it in 6 minutes, but that's completely fine. Should we then go for Catherine?
Thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this. It's a super exciting initiative. I'm really glad you're doing this, and it's so fun for me to see some of my colleagues from far away virtually. So thank you for organizing this. I researched the presidency and gender, so my comments are going to be mostly related to the presidency, which is often considered the most powerful office in the world, but certainly in Latin America, full of presidentialist regimes, hyper-presidentialist regimes. The presidency is often considered the most, or at least one of the most male-dominated. So in the past 30 years or so, since 1990, women have won about 6% of presidential elections, not only in Latin America, but also in the rest of the world. So I'm currently working on a book on how women win presidential elections in Latin America, exploring why political parties nominate women for president and the role of gender stereotypes in presidential politics. So I wanted to speak sort of to the challenges concerning women's access to presidential power, taking a step back a little bit and addressing this question of why do men and masculinity continue to dominate in presidential politics. So as I mentioned, male dominance in the presidency of Latin America is pretty similar to the rest of the world when you look at the rates of women being elected. And so I sort of think that some of the forces or factors that maintain male dominance in Latin America may be similar to in other countries in the world. So gender stereotypes could matter. So feminist theories have long pointed out that the traits that people want in their presidents, the traits that people expect in their presidents, also happen to be the same kind of traits that they associate with the male sex. So this is the classic double bind. So according to these theories, if women appear presidential, that's good, but they're going to be punished for not appearing feminine or not living up to expectations concerning their own gender identity. And if they act feminine, well, that's good in terms of their gender identity, but then they will be punished for not acting presidential. So this is the classic double bind that I think applies, or perhaps could apply especially to the presidency, which is considered one of the most masculinist offices in the world. And so we expect our presidents to be tough, to be aggressive, to be strong, et cetera. We expect that from men, but not from women. There are some reasons, though, to doubt whether this actually does perpetuate male dominance and the dominance of masculinity in the Latin American presidency. And Malu sort of mentioned a little bit of this, but survey experiments and just surveys in general in Latin America don't seem to reveal such an anti-woman bias. And so particularly the survey experiments that I'm familiar with from Brazil show this sort of pro-woman preference. And it could be pro-female, pro-woman, or pro-femininity bias. there's different ways of examining this question. And it could be related to benevolent sexism. But there's certain traits that voters seem to associate with women, and they also seem to desire in their leaders. So that's when we're thinking about, why do men and masculinity continue to dominate, it may not be so related to voter preferences, but rather, why political parties continue to nominate time and time again so many men as candidates. But another reason why men and masculinity may continue to dominate in presidential politics in Latin America relates to the ways that citizens react to female presidents or women presidents in Latin America. So we've had, the straight of women presidents, first Nicaragua, Panama, Chile, Argentina, Costa Rica, then Brazil, now Honduras. We've had them, throughout the region. And recent studies have shown that citizens actually evaluate women presidents differently than male presidents, maintaining other factors, for example, macroeconomic factors constant. So women presidents tend to have lower presidential approval ratings than men presidents. Again, these are statistical models holding constant GDP growth, inflation, unemployment rates, rates of homicide, different things. And another study, which I actually, okay, 2 minutes. And another study that I published a couple years ago showed that when in the presence of a scandal, citizens tend to punish women presidents more than male presidents. And as we see corruption in the executive branch rise, again, citizens tend to disapprove more of female presidents than male presidents. So it seems that there are double standards at work once women attain the presidency. So how do women win the presidency in the first place? Again, I do think that it's important to look at the reasons and motivations behind political parties nominating women for president. So women tend to win the presidency either via incumbent parties or via strong established parties. Men have often won the presidency in Latin America with these small new parties, very weak parties, but women don't do that. And so we have to look at, why do these incumbent parties, these established parties nominate women instead of men? And one of the arguments that I've been trying to make for a few years now is that parties, when they think that they need to signal novelty, they need to signal change, they need to signal moral integrity, competency on these feminine issues, they may have greater incentives to nominate women over men for president. So gender stereotypes, these associations that could be viewed as sort of positive, associating women in politics with these positive traits, that could provide a way for opportunities for women to access these presidential nominations. Once nominated, the fate of these women seem to depend sort of on the nuts and bolts of presidential elections, fundamentals. For example, whether voters generally prefer to continue with the incumbent party or whether they generally want to give an opportunity to the challenger party to rule. In that sense, women and men seem to win presidential elections in similar ways. I'll stop there because I think I've gone over my time. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. And that was fine. Don't worry about it. And Juliana?
Okay, thank you so much for the invitation. I'm really excited to be with you, and it's really interesting network that you're creating. So I wanted to start seconding what Malu and Catherine already said about women's presence, and just a reminder, Latin America is the region of the world with the highest percentage of women in legislatures, and that without a doubt presents an immense opportunity for transforming politics, or at least trying. Of course, Brazil and other countries are lagging, but Mexico, Bolivia, Costa Rica, Argentina have over 40% of women, or 50%. And that's absolutely an absolute transformation. Like 30 years ago in the 90s, we had 10% women in most countries, and some countries had 2%, 5%, one woman in the Senate. So I think that represents an important opportunity. Of course, the women who are in parliaments tend to be whiter, urban, more educated, than most of the population, but it still is an improvement from what we had 30 years ago. And as we have seen those changes, which are the result of gender quotas, there have also, we're starting to see some innovation in terms of the inclusion of other groups, notably LGBTQ people. So Mexico has provisions specifically, these are not legally binding and are more like recommendations, but more attention to LGBTQ groups as political actors. And in Colombia recently had an electoral reform that was eventually struck down by the Constitutional Court, but it included also recommendations for the inclusion of LGBTQ people in electoral lists. And there are some recommendations and measures to include youth, Afro-Colombians or Afro-descendants, indigenous groups. So those, of course, are important opportunities for transforming politics, right? My research, which started as, I started looking at gender quotas, but eventually completely changed, looks at violence and harassment. And that is kind of the other side of that coin, is that as we've seen more and more women in politics, we've also start to see much more reports of violence and harassment. And Latin America is leading the way in this discussion. This is a global problem. If you're paying attention to elections around the world, to like the 2016 election here in the United States was notable for acts of acts of symbolic violence. So violence and harassment against women politicians is very prevalent. And in Latin America, activists and women politicians organized in associations of women in politics have been talking about this problem since 1999. That was when the first group of women started to talk about this in Bolivia, which is a somewhat unlikely place for this type of discussion, but nonetheless, it's been the leader in the debate. So violence and harassment refers to basically acts of pressure, persecution, or harassment that seek to push women out of politics. And this happens to women candidates during elections. There are some reports that violence increases around elections, and specifically gender-based violence against women who are running for office. But also, and I think this is really important, and we're not paying enough attention to this, once women are elected. And this is problematic. And just to keep in mind, this is not it's a form of political violence because it happens in politics and it happens to political actors, but it's not about politics. It happens regardless of party, regardless of ideology. It doesn't matter. It happens to all women, basically. It's as long as they are involved in politics, they will probably be victims of violence. It is an effort to undermine descriptive representation and to, again, push women out of politics, but it also has effects on women's substantive representation. It affects how women can represent either women if they think of themselves as representing women's interests, but also more broadly, the interests of their constituents. And it includes, there are a wide range of manifestations. So we've talked about physical violence, and you probably know the case of Marielle Franco, who was killed in Brazil in 2018, and that is the most extreme form of violence against women in politics. But also sexual and psychological violence, economic violence, which is the use of resources and control of access to those resources to undermine women's presence and women are as political actors. So what I found in my research is, for example, in elections, parties are very, very reluctant to give women money for running an effective campaign. And this is even in places such as in Colombia that have specific provisions for political parties to give money to women. So Colombian parties have to, they do have public money, like they receive money from the state, and they have to give, I think it's 2% or 5% of their money they receive from the state to women training or women's candidacies. And women don't get that money, or they get it just as in this past legislative election. Some women, there's a feminist party who was having issues as well. They received the money 1 week before the campaign was done. And that is it's unacceptable. I mean, there's no way of running a campaign with only a week left. And once women are elected, even when they win, they have difficulty accessing and regaining the money that they personally invested. So that is a way of controlling what women can do. And some women have said, for example, that they have a lot of issues accessing the money, but their male counterparts, even when they lose, don't have those difficulties. So it's that's a form of violence, and we can talk about that in the conversation at the end. And the other form of violence, it's what we've called semiotic violence or symbolic violence. And this is not as overt, and it's not as significant as threatening someone, I think, but it has an effect over time. Is a bunch of the way women are addressed, the way women are portrayed in, okay, and I'm almost done. Social media, sexualized images, all that undermines women's presence as political actors and questions their legitimacy. So I'm going to stop there. My 5 minutes are up, but I'll be happy to talk about this more in the Q&A or at the end, in the discussion at the end. Thank you so much.
Thanks for those presentations. That was a very, very interesting point to start our conversation. Can everyone hear me? Yeah, I think I unmuted myself. Okay, so if as I was hearing these points of conversation, I keep hearing most of them were still challenges, right? The acknowledgement of, okay, in the last, I don't know, 50 years, things have changed, numbers have increased, women are invited in to some extent to the party. However, there are still a lot of challenges. Some of them, the institutional barriers created by formal institutions that keep marginalized groups out, as Malu said, or in the case of Catherine point, the idea of stereotypes or the double standards used for women. And also even the positive side of using women as a novelty to refresh a party, to give a fresh restart to an old political party. They still have a double threat for women and their candidacy. And of course, the point that Juliana was making about not just the violence and the harassment during the candidacy or the election period, but also when women are in office, and how symbolic violence plays a huge role in there as well. So that's a lot of points to see as challenge. And I wanted to invite, I will say, Eme Martinez, that have a really nice comment to make about language and how language matters. And hi, I know that you want to make this point, so maybe I can unmute.
Hello.
Hello.
What would you like me to say? Sorry, I completely.
No, don't worry. I was just inviting you to read your comment.
It's just when we use gender, I think it gets really confusing, because gender is not really the same. It's not the same discrimination. Someone who has, I don't know, a feminine gender identity, or however you want to call it, or somebody who presents as feminine, or that they assume a traditionally female gender role, feminine gender role, sorry. It's not the same discrimination as women. The discrimination against women is not recognized by most people. Men tend to suppress the recognition anyway about it, because then they would be a disadvantage and than they are now. So it was just that. When we talk about gender, I find it problematic. I think we're talking about the female sex, because that's where the oppression and the this type of oppression is happening. That's all that I was trying to say. Obviously, if a man presents as feminine or they identify as a woman, they have a certain oppression, but it's sort of different unless everybody acknowledges that they are a woman. I don't know if I'm making any sense, but what I mean is gender and sex are different, and gender is more like the external aspect that patriarchy has imposed on both sexes. But obviously, we're not recognizing the oppression of women or the slavery of women. If we say that, we are exaggerating, but that's all, sorry. I went on for too long.
No, don't worry. Thank you for the comment. So I do believe in the last part of your comment in the chat was, I think language matters and language do matter, right? We're still talking in the binary, right? We are talking about female quotas. And then what about trans communities? I think in all the history of Ecuador, we have one trans woman as a member of Congress. And that also presents their own challenges on the political agenda. So maybe we can start with, so any particular questions about the presentations that someone wants to raise? Or can I start with the first question that we have for this panel, that I think it's a very nice point to start. Okay, I will go with the first question that someone else presented, like, why do men and masculinities continue to dominate presidential politics? So we have been talking about how benevolent representation, how some good traits are related to women and how can they refresh, but still, how can men and masculinity continue to dominate politics?
Is this open for all of us?
Yes, if you can unmute yourself, you just.
Okay. I just briefly, I did address this question directly, but just to add on to my previous comments, I mean, we do see a wave of, authoritarian populism, not only in Latin America, but in the world. And so there has been work on thinking about how male populists use masculinity to accrue power. So and we see this, for example, with Putin and Trump and Bolsonaro, and there's many examples across the world. And so thinking about and here we can make the distinguish between sex and gender, right? So you can be biological male, self-identifies male, but you show your masculinity through performance, through imagery, through riding shirtless horseback. When we think about Putin, and there's many examples of showing off military honors as we might have seen, military men in Latin America obtain the presidency, Perón, Chavez. There's many examples to historically to think about. So, thinking more in terms of contemporary politics, and just to sort of throw this out, we might think of ways that populist authoritarianism has these affinities with masculinity, and how men in particular are well positioned to assume these traits of populist heroes, military heroes, and obtain and maintain power in that way.
Yeah, just picking up on some of what Catherine said, because I've been, as the Brazilian elections approach, I've been asked to speak quite a bit about the gender gap in vote intention in Brazil. And because we started seeing this in 2018, and now we're seeing it again, that there is a huge gap of over 10 percentage points in vote intention between men and women in terms of support for Bolsonaro. And this is the first time that it happens, and it's the only level that it's happening, right? And so if you go to the subnational level, you don't see this gender gap. And although I do think that there are other explanations for that as well, in terms of why this gap is emerging, I think that one of the explanations is going back to what Catherine was just saying, the performance of masculinity of Bolsonaro, that both that ends up creating incentives in different directions for women and men in the electorate. And so on the one hand, men, male voters or relate to that in a stronger way, while at the same time, women voters are less likely to relate to that. And then I think that also has to do, I think that other factors somewhat touched on that as well, because I think that one of the other factors that's contributing to this is Bolsonaro's handle of the pandemic. And there has been lots of studies on, gender in the pandemic and the ways in which, care and health are associated with femininity, and how that has also meant expectations and behavior that has been different from women leaders. But I just wanted to pick up on the earlier question as well that Martinez has put on the chat, because just to say that, I do think that there is something to be said about the term of like gender quotas, and the extent to which the term characterizes the policy well. But I also think that it's difficult because some policies in the region are actually gender quotas while others are sex quotas. And so unless we start actually differentiating between them, and like putting them into like different categories, which is not what we've been doing, right? Like generally we've been essentially like putting them all in the same package. But that is all to say that some policies in the region are gender quotas in the sense that they do, encompass the candidacies of trans women as well, right? As cis women. And I think that there is something else to be said about institutional layering here that also prevents or complicates the issue further. And so, for example, laws pertaining to changes of social name and changes of or use of candidate's name also complicates the issue. And so, for example, in Brazil, candidates can run for office by choosing the name that they want to, and this applies to every candidate. And so you can have like Barack Obama running for office in Brazil because someone has decided that their candidate name is Barack Obama. But this has also meant that there are that there are implications for trans people running for office using social names, even if they haven't been able to change it legally. And so I think that this is a conversation that does matter and that warrants discussion. But I think that there are differentiations, right, in terms of the types of quotas that are present in the region.
And I will jump in here and include some of Gloria's comments. So Gloria was saying, hey, yes, the conversation is talking about quotas, but maybe we can think a little bit more about what are other chances to talk about LGBT representation. And then she also mentions how do the panel see the current direction of the Supreme Court banning women's body autonomy rights and the introducing of prayer in schools again? What do the panel have to say this about representation and politics and the political agenda, I think from the US in this case? And how can you see this as a patriarchal religion approach or framework created by these? And also, please, while the panel is here for this particular conversation, all the participants can chip in. That's the whole point of the chat. Thank you, Gloria, for starting that. And I can read your questions, or you can just raise your hand and hop to the conversation. Malu, are you raising your hand?
I mean, I don't know. I don't want to like be talking all the time here. I think, I mean, I don't have much to say about the US, to be honest, as I'm not someone who studies the US. The only thing I can say, it's really depressing. And I think that it is a warning for for us all in Latin America as well. But I think that one of the things that we have, that we're already seeing in the region is the increasing influence of, religion in Latin America has always been incredibly powerful in influencing politics, like period, right? There's nothing to be said about that. But I mean, I think that we're seeing a change now as many countries in the region undergo a process of religious transition from Catholicism to Pentecostal evangelism. And this is something that's happening very, very quickly in the Brazilian context. And I'm sorry for like going back to Brazil as an example. But, current estimations put Pentecostal evangelicals as representing 30% of the population. And the expectation is that by 2030, there will have been complete, transition so that the majority of the population is Pentecostal evangelical. Now, there are, differences in terms of, studies show that Pentecostal evangelicals tend to vote differently and also have prioritize moral agendas that are also associated with, rights, particularly those related to gender equality and LGBTQI plus people. And so I think that that is something that has been increasingly important in the region, and we're seeing already the implications of that in processes in Colombia and in Costa Rica, in Peru, and in other countries in the region. And so, I mean, I just wanted to, that's all I have to say, and about this topic. But I think that it is definitely, if we're thinking about democracy and gender, I think that that is a core topic to put into the agenda.
Someone else wanted to add? Maybe I have a question, my own question, propping from that comment. So if we are considering that Latin America is a region very influenced by religion, and there is a shift in religions and beliefs, how that is affecting women's leadership and how women lead and the political agenda that, how these changes have reflected in women's leadership and maybe even feminist political agenda or the constraints to it.
I think something, I don't really know how that affects how women lead. That's not the research that I do, and I'm not sure I know anyone who's actually thinking about that really important question. But I think the rise, I'm not sure rise is the right question, but the increased attention to anti-gender or anti-women and LGBTQ movements in Brazil and Colombia does have or has impacted women's mobilization. I think that's probably where I think we can see, or I could speak a bit more about that. I think, and Elizabeth can speak about this way more, but in the Colombian 2016 peace agreement, anti-genderism had an impact on the rejection of the agreement, but I think it also indirectly or a long-term impact of that anti-genderism is mobilization from women and LGBTQ activism, and I cannot speak of this from a very academic and scientific perspective. It's just my opinion. What I think is happening is the recent election of the left in Colombia. And for those of you who don't know, like, Colombia has never really elected a different president, a progressive president. His vice president is the first Black woman to be elected, and she's a Black feminist. She's absolutely progressive, way more than he is, than Petro is. I think that is a response to the rejection of the peace agreement and the current administration, Duque's administration, and his inability to actually implement it. He ran a campaign and he won because he opposed the peace agreement, and he's done very little in terms of implementation. I mean, he has done some, but it's not as much as he should have done. So I think that is a response. The election of this progressive government that is coming in August is a response to that. And I think that's, I think, a more positive take on this. I mean, of course, from a feminist perspective, the election of anti-feminist presidents is, of course, devastating. And this is not just presidents, it's also justices, members of Congress. But I think, and actually we were talking about this with Elizabeth yesterday, is one of the effects of that is that people mobilize, because it's like, I mean, when President Trump was elected, a lot of people said that Roe v. Wade was safe, and a lot of feminists were actually saying, no, it's not, we should do something about it. And I think it's very clear for feminist activists that mobilization is necessary, even if things seem safe. So I'm sure that makes a lot of sense.
I think it does, yeah. But you then are describing a context of a lot of tension, right? So when the anti-genderism movement presents a move forward, then you are also reflecting on the idea of how progressive or feminist movements also restart a fight. So we might be talking about also a polarization in views, like a very divided society. I think for the Colombian case, you can see also that in the elections, right? It was a very small margin for those elections. Yeah, for the presidency, was it?
I don't know the actual number, but I think it wasn't as small. I think it was about 2 million votes. So like, it's in the second round, and but we do see polarization, I think, in Colombia and in other countries as well. But I'm not sure that's just the result of anti-genderism. It probably also has to do with social media and like how we are consuming information, which is a discussion for another day. But I do think there's some polarization. Yeah, and yeah, so that's what I have to say, and I don't want to hoard the discussion. So,
Catherine, you mentioned that you have a comment on heteronormativity and the presidency in Latin America.
Just as Gloria was asking about LGBT issues, and so I just thought I'd maybe throw something out here. And so when we think about, you know, how men and masculinity dominate the presidency, it's also very heteronormative. So historically, you know, when we look at also these populists, and even today, right, you have these male populists, and one of the ways that they demonstrate their masculinity is through their beautiful wives or beautiful partners. So we can think of, you know, Carlos Menem and Cecilia Boloco. We can also think of Trump himself, you know, thinking about the United States. There's different examples of that. And so it's not only masculinity that people expect, but people expect heteronormativity for men and for women. So when we think about, okay, we've had women, you know, win presidential elections, but we've never had, you know, homosexual man that's openly, right? Or a lesbian woman, for example, access the presidency. So there's the top position still remains so difficult to change in that sense. And the other small thing I just wanted to add in here is that I think that, you know, Juliana and Malu were mentioning, you know, we have made great progress in women's representation, but it's particularly in these legislators and it's legislative bodies, and it's particularly thanks to gender quotas. We don't have that for presidential elections. You know, there's no institutional mechanism to assure that we'll have some kind of rotation between men and women with the presidency. And so that has been a great opportunity for women in legislators, but it hasn't had a direct effect. We haven't had institutional innovations in terms of sex quotas or gender quotas for presidential elections. So that's an area where you know, the region and other parts of the world as well could improve on.
If I may also pick up on Gloria's question about the main challenges that LGBTQI plus people are facing in politics in the region. And Catherine has just talked about some of them in terms of heteronormativity and expectations of heteronormativity and performance and leadership. But I think that some of the other ones, well, one relates back to what I was talking about in terms of the differences in institutions, right? And so particularly when you're talking about gender quotas, whether or not trans women are part of the quotas and would fulfill quotas. And this is something that is not only a problem in terms of the institution itself, but also about the availability of information. And so when I was giving a course a while back for political outsiders and aspirants, a trans woman came to talk to me because she wasn't sure as to whether the quota applied, right, to trans women, because parties themselves had not been very receptive to her and didn't know that information. And so I think that that's part of one of the ways, right, in which this challenge emerges. And the other thing is violence, right? Because violence, like political violence, the ways in which it is, the ways in which candidates or elected officials experience violence, not only gendered, but racialized as well, right? And gender identity and sexuality also play a role in this. Now, measuring violence is very difficult, and Juliana will know a lot more about that. And capturing violence is very difficult, right? Because of these different ways in which violence takes place, and the extent to which it's reported or captured, etc. But in 2020, as part of this effort that I was mentioning in my talk, we did 100 candidate interviews with outsider candidates who had never run for office, and many of them were trans, and also, and many of them were, Black women, and so we had variation of, gender, race, and ethnicity, as well as gender identity, and we also had variation in sexuality. And it does seem that, essentially, Black women and trans women are suffering more violence than, white cis women, and that the type of violence is also different and incredibly vile. Now, and that is something that of course is also impacting not only their descriptive representation, but also, as Juliana was saying, their actions and their actual work lives when they are in office. So I think I'll stop here, but I think I just wanted to add that.
I wanted to add now, so we have been discussing about the representation of LGBTQI communities or spaces for this. What about racialized representation? How are we thinking about Afro women or indigenous women and how they are represented in elections, or, yeah. Or how this intersection makes everything a little bit more complicated. Yes, Maria Amelia, hi.
Yeah, hi everyone. Thanks again for this invitation, and thanks to everyone for your excellent remarks and sharing your work and your ideas. So I think it's a great opportunity to insert a colonial framework on this conversation, and that was part of some of my questions that you might have received, which is how, when we look at these problems, issues, inequality from a colonial perspective, then I believe it's a little bit easier to understand the history, kind of like the structural forces that are still informing the way in which women and trans women, what I will call the feminine, beyond your biological body, are represented, categorized, and then that automatically positions you in category that will automatically almost inhibit rights. So how, as scholars and also scholars informing policymakers, how can we think through a colonial framework in order to understand that colonial framework, independently of where we are located, right? Colonial framework, as we know, is not only applied to Latin America. There's colonialists throughout the world, right? Nevertheless, with your question on racialization, the way colonization has worked and neo-colonization continues to work, continues to change the way in which, for example, women are racialized. And the racialization of the female, I will say, has, as we know, direct implications, as some of you were saying, on not only access to politics, political representation, education, health, well-being, entertainment, pleasure, and so forth, but also has everything to do with who gets to decide, who gets to speak, who gets to write, who gets to publish, and you can help me fill in the blanks. And those, what different authors have called an even knowledge production in all the spheres that you have all addressed, continues to, again, hinder rights, the rights as we know them. And in that sense, even the rights discourse sometimes falls short of these intersectionalities, right? When we look at every single one of the variables and we can kind of unfold these variables and see how are these variables intersecting with one another, in which space, from which geography, from which embodied geography, right? Being our body is our first geography, then the implications are broad. And I would love to take this opportunity just to add, I will talk about that further in my presentation next. But with Gloria, we have seen how the gender ideology and the anti-gender wars have a huge impact in women's and LGBT rights. What Wendy Brown calls the de-democratization of rights as part of a very specific agenda. And that agenda not only has continued with very incredible funding, resources, strategic coalitions across the continent, right? It's not only throughout the Americas, but as we know, comes from Europe and has extended to the United States. So how can we better understand the linkages between these anti-gender wars and these, for example, lack of access in representational politics? And then when you finally have someone, as you mentioned, Colombian vice president, how far within that positionality can you go in order to change the actual structure of inequalities?
Maria Amelia, that's a very nice question to ask to the panel. How far can you go? So once considering the vice president of Colombia and the wonderful slogan of Vivir Sabroso, so once you are there, once you're that visible, how far can you go? Or what do you think? And please, as you see, this conversation can be extended to everyone that is participating. So yeah, I want to pose Maria Amelia's question. How far do you think you can move within that positionality?
I'm sorry, I don't want to, again, be the only one speaking, but I do want to caution against expecting one single person to change a whole system. And I think, of course, I mean, expecting that a new government with a promise agenda, like a progressive agenda that is grounded on the protection and expansion of rights is important. It symbolically is important, but also the expectation that it creates, and how it's definitely different from other governments that have not been as and I'm talking about Colombia, but I think this applies to other countries, or that haven't been as open as to the expansion of rights. But I think it's a bit unfair to put a lot of pressure on Francia Marquez, just as it is to put the pressure to change politics on women, even as collective actors. I think the system is very much a colonial system, and it's a very much hetero-patriarchal system, and it resists change a lot. And as much as I said at the beginning of my talk, we've changed the face of politics in the last 30 years, but it's not enough. Like, patriarchy has resisted. Like, resistance has also been the constant throughout those, even before, like in the transitions from authoritarian government, women were activists and were important in undermining authoritarian regimes, but they were excluded in those moments of transition. Sorry, I muted myself. I think, of course, and we should have high expectations, but also be mindful that one single person or that the norm is resistance to change, and not basically blame one woman or some women for not being able to achieve that, which I think it is a much long-term process of fully transforming politics.
Yes, definitely. Gloria, you have your hand raised, and I think you can speak now.
Yes. Yes, thank you very much. And I was thinking, now that you mentioned Francia, I was thinking about what happened with Epsi Campbell in Costa Rica. She faced a lot of racism all the way during the government. And I think that it is very important. She was a feminist too, and she faced a lot of attacks. And I think that this is an example, and this is something that we have to take in count about what can happen now in Colombia. It was maybe mainly from the conservatives, but not only. And I think that it is interesting to put an eye on that. And I was thinking that in Mexico, we have had quotas for indigenous for a long time. But it happens, it seems that it happens that when the quotas appear, the parties are interested in really appointing some indigenous people. But now, as Juliana said, that we have Afro-Mexicans and LGBT and youth and some others in inclusion quotas, it seems that indigenous disappear. So it's like a moda, that you just start responding to the demand that the electoral system is asking, but there's not a change in the mind, it really in the meaning of this in this struggle that we're facing in politics for these all groups that are discriminated. Thanks.
Thank you, Gloria. Catherine, do you have something to add?
Oh, I just want to echo a little bit what Juliana's warning or concern with, expecting women, particularly women from minority groups, to, transform politics. So just to further her point, this creates these higher standards for women, and we know the dangers of higher standards, right? Then they punish you even more. Why don't we expect the same from men? Why don't we expect the same from women who are white, et cetera? So, so these, I just want to echo what Juliana was saying in terms of these expectations. I think Gloria was speaking to this as well. And then the other point I just wanted to make is, I think I don't work so deeply with this theoretical framework, but feminist institutionalism can teach us a lot about the difficulties that women and men have in pursuing gender equality, pro-women change, LGBT rights, et cetera. And so Georgina Whalen has worked a lot on this. And so, you know, again, we have these expectations for women to promote these policies, but they face these institutions that were created by men that, you know, reflect male preferences, that tend to try to maintain the status quo and reproduce themselves. And so without acknowledging these broader institutional forces, it's hard to get a good, have the correct expectations or accurate expectations of how much women and racial minorities can, or sexual minorities as well, can change politics.
I wanted to ask a question. So, and this was based a little bit on Gloria's point on the idea of trends and una moda electoral. So we have the indigenous people, and we put indigenous people in quotas. We think about women, we think about quotas, we think, so how are we connecting the idea of political representation and people in power with changes in the broader society and the way people think and communities think, and how they're connected, and where do we start, basically? And I know that Estefania has also raised her hand, so maybe we can go with Estefania first.
Okay, hi. Hi. Well, hi, Andrea. Yeah, I put my hand up because I started thinking about the same that you were asking right now about these trends. And I'm thinking about Colombia, but I'm also thinking about Ecuador and how this mechanism that we have to try to find this participation from minority groups, no matter which we talk, does not really reflect the society. And when I say society, I talk about the organizations that work for different fields and the people, the demography in general. And that's where we start seeing the trends. Somebody said, I can't remember if it was Juliana, about these other factors that make us so divided as a society, and so divided in the electoral process. That you were talking about how much was the difference between Petro and the second option in Colombia. It was around 1-2% in the second round, and how what we consume in social networks and media affects this structure. And it's so interesting because I think that we are starting to realize that quotas are not enough, are not enough to represent all of the minorities that coexist in the Latin American social structure. And that's why we see trends. We see trends because we cannot support as many quotas as we would need to be really representative of the population if we don't do something to innovate. And I think it was Malena from Brazil that were saying that we're lacking this innovation of other ways to allow minorities to be part and to gain access to political structures. So that's what I think about that topic.
Thank you, Stefania. So can I ask the panel, what have you seen in terms of innovation then? That's a very good point to start wrapping up the panel and think, okay, if we know the problem, if we understand the problem, if we understand that there are trends, if we have learned through the years of moving forward in representation, what are some innovations that we can see in the future? Or what would you like to see?
Yeah, if I may, Andrea, and I think that this speaks a little bit to Maria Amelia's comments as well, because, you know, as we've been talking about, and I think that all of us are sort of talking about the institutional barriers and the barriers from insiders, right, to resist change, and how, because insiders are overwhelmingly men, that also means the reproduction of you know, masculine and heteronormative behaviors and preferences. It's been difficult to achieve change even in the context of quotas. One thing that I wanted to say before moving into innovation is just that I think that, you know, quotas are put in place with this idea of like fast tracking, right? Something that society itself would take very long to change. But that doesn't mean also that, and Catherine also spoke about that, about, you know, the lower representation of women or other marginalized groups does not necessarily mean that it's because of a lack of demand from voters, because oftentimes it might simply be a product of, you know, these institutional as well as other barriers from insiders to purposefully try to keep people from power. And so I think that, you know, with that nuance in place. But I wanted to talk about innovation because I think that that it speaks also to Maria Amelia's point. And I think that one of the most interesting, well, the two innovations that I've been seeing in Brazil that I think are the most interesting, one of them I think speaks more directly to her point about, you know, decolonizing political practices. And one of them is the concept and the idea of collective mandates, mandatos coletivos. And I think that that's really powerful because in Brazilian legislative elections, the system is designed around a personal vote. And so the idea is that not only individuals are not only competing against, you know, others from other parties, but also against people from their own parties to be the top of the list. And what has been happening, particularly since 2016, is that particularly women and women from marginalized groups. And here I'm really emphasizing marginalized groups and not minorities, because Afro-Brazilians are a majority in Brazil, right? Even though they're marginalized in all, you know, aspects of society, and politics is one of them. So even though, you know, Afro-Brazilian are the majority of the population, they are the least presented in politics. So women from marginalized groups have been putting together these collective candidacies, which basically mean you have one person is elected, multiple people who are campaigning around them and getting votes to support that candidacy. But then once that person gets elected, they're also operating within this notion of collectivity to design a plan for office, right? And so I think that that's a really interesting way of thinking about something from outside of the system to change the very ethos of how the system functions. I think that another innovation that has been coming up in Brazil, particularly since 2018, is these candidate training programs. And there are now more than 50 of them in the country. They're very different from the ones in the US because they emerged in this context of the crisis of representation, and they're purposefully anti-party. Now, that raises the question of how effective they are, because you cannot run an independent candidacy in Brazil. And so you need parties as well. But it's interesting how, you know, their emergence has created this tension and sort of like competition that has forced parties to rethink descriptive representation. And so I think that that's a different way as well that civil society has been organizing to affect you know, formal politics in very meaningful ways.
Thank you. That was really, really great. Someone else wanted to add to those mechanisms from different examples, different geographies.
I do have two innovations. One is actually similar to what Malu was mentioning. It's an experience of a feminist political party that was formed in Colombia in a very conservative city, and this party, explicitly feminist, explicitly intersectional, is they have one woman in the city council, but this is what they call a collective mandate, and basically it's the woman making, like, she's the official member of the council, but the party collectively makes the decision, and the decisions, they were running also for Senate. Unfortunately, they didn't win, but it was also a collective effort of this person is the person who's sitting on that chair, but they are making collective decisions. So it's another example. And the other innovation that I think it's also important, and this is very much in relation to violence against women in politics, but I think it applies to more than just violence. It's the association of women at the municipal level, like women mayors, women councilors, and they have emerged throughout Latin America. Most countries have some, and they're usually small, but they not only have been basically the ones promoting legislation to criminalize violence against women in politics, but they also have training programs, not just for candidates. I think some have training for candidates, but it's mostly training for women once they are in office. And I think this is really important, because one of the things that I found is, especially with women at the local level, is women who were civil society activists, and they were called to fill out the quotas, and they actually do want to do a good job, but they don't know how. Like, it's not the how of what they want to do, it's more like the technicalities, like how do you present a project, what resources can you use, how can you administer those resources, how's the council supposed to work, and those organizations actually provide training in that regard. It's basically telling women, once you're elected, this is what you can do, and this is the reach of your mandate, and this is how you, for example, exercise accountability on the mayor or other authorities. So I think those are really interesting innovation as well, and they are coming. They occupy a great space because these are women politicians, but they work more as civil society organizations.
I just wanted to add one comment about institutional innovations, specifically in presidential politics. I just want to mention that there's some theories of, like, if you have more women with political experience, more women legislators, then you're going to have more women presidents. But actually, there's not that strong of a correlation between more women legislators and greater possibilities for women presidents. So the idea that supply is just going to naturally lead to more women leaders doesn't really hold out. I wanted to point out, so basically we need some institutional innovations in order to enhance gender equality in this realm. And Fernanda made this comment, and I don't know, I forget what her last name was, but Fernanda made this comment in the chat. This really great point that, and I don't know if Fernanda wants to say this, or I can just remind everyone what she said. There's a debate about applying quotas for executive positions, and actually there's in the gubernatorial elections, there's horizontal gender quotas, and so that, yeah, I don't. There's the comment, and as you know, Malu says too, there's the quotas applies to VPs. So there's ways to think about this, and it requires, it'll require more of a greater public discussion and things. But that's, and I haven't heard of debates, for the presidency itself in different countries. But there's certainly ways that you can enhance women's descriptive representation at the subnational level, as they're doing in Mexico and in these VP positions. There's also cabinets, gender quotas, sex quotas for cabinets and things like that. So that's where I think that these need to go. I don't know if Fernanda wants to pick up on that, but thank you, Fernanda, for that comment and reminding us of that.
Perfect, thank you. And at this point, I have to thank everyone for all these comments. And while we started in the challenges and in all the difficulties of holding power or fighting for power and representation, not only power, now we're ending on the innovations. And at the heart of the innovations, well, they are formal mechanisms, as what Catherine was saying. I put a lot of my hope in the community-based experiments or changes or structures that are created to really present transformative agendas. And at this point, we can stop and have a 15-minute break, because I know that sitting down in front of the computer it's very hard. So we can reconvene in 15 minutes. So